The paradox of intelligence, why the smart get fooled, Nietzsche. There's a strange and uncomfortable truth that no one really wants to say out loud. Intelligence, and the very thing we've been taught to admire, can become a trap. Not just a weakness, but a prison. And not because intelligence is inherently flawed, but because it carries with it a hidden blind spot. The smarter we are, the more convinced we become that we are immune to deception, and in that confidence, we often become the easiest to fool. This is the paradox. This is what Nietzsche warned us about over and over again in ways that most people completely misunderstand. He didn't despise intelligence. He feared what intelligence becomes when it lacks self-awareness, when it believes too much in its own narrative, when it turns into pride dressed as reason. And if we're being honest with ourselves, we've all felt it. The moment where we outthink ourselves, where we rationalize away our own instincts, where our intellect builds a story so convincing that we don't even realize we're lying to ourselves. Nietzsche once wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations." That wasn't a call to abandon truth. It was a warning that even the smartest mind can be seduced by its own logic. That intelligence doesn't guarantee clarity, it just guarantees better arguments. And the more skilled we become at constructing those arguments, the more likely we are to justify whatever we want to believe. Think about that. Intelligence gives you the power to win debates even against yourself. You can argue yourself into inaction. You can convince yourself that your fear is wisdom, but that your hesitation is prudence, that your desire to avoid discomfort is actually self-care. And all of it can sound completely rational, even admirable. But deep down, something inside you knows you're not being honest. You're being clever.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
And that's the first clue to the paradox. Intelligence, when unbalanced, becomes a tool for self-deception. The very thing that should help us see clearly becomes the lens that distorts everything. Because once we identify as intelligent, we start protecting that identity. We stop asking questions that might make us feel stupid. We stop admitting when we're confused. We become attached to being the person who already knows. And that attachment blinds us. Nietzsche called this the will to truth. But he knew that most people didn't actually want truth. They wanted the feeling of truth. And they wanted certainty. And intelligence, with all its complexity and nuance, makes it dangerously easy to simulate that feeling. So let me ask you something deeply uncomfortable. What if the thing you're most proud of your intelligence is the very thing keeping you stuck? What if your ability to analyze, to critique, to question is actually shielding you from the raw, uncomfortable reality that you need to face? What if every time you say, "I'm still thinking about it," what you really mean is, "I'm too afraid to act"? And what if your intelligence is helping you hide that fear from yourself? This is where Nietzsche becomes brutally honest. He didn't believe in comforting lies. He believed in breaking illusions, especially the ones we build around ourselves. He knew that the smartest people often become the most deluded not because they're dumb, but because they're too good at protecting their own egos. They create elaborate philosophies to justify their pain. They build intellectual fortresses around their wounds. They turn suffering into identity, and identity into ideology. And before long, they no longer seek truth, they seek coherence. They want their ideas to make sense, even if their lives don't. And you've seen this. You've felt it. You've met people who are brilliant on paper, masters of theory, but completely disconnected from their own reality. They can explain everything except themselves. They can deconstruct the universe, but can't hold a conversation without posturing. They've become prisoners of their own intellect. And the worst part, they don't even know it. Because intelligence, when left unchecked, becomes a mirror that only reflects what we want to see. And the smarter we are, the more convincing those reflections become. But this doesn't mean intelligence is bad. It means it's dangerous when it isn't paired with humility, with awareness, with the willingness to admit, I don't know. Intelligence without humility becomes arrogance, and arrogance is the most fertile ground for self-deception. Nietzsche understood this better than anyone. He didn't preach ignorance, he preached honesty, the kind of honesty that hurts, the kind that forces you to strip away all your cleverness and ask, what am I pretending not to know? What truths am I avoiding because they threaten the identity I built around being smart? Because here's the harsh reality, the mind is a trickster. It can justify anything. It can make illusions feel like insights. It can package fear as logic, laziness as analysis, and avoidance as complexity. And the smarter you are, the better you get at it. That's why intelligence by itself isn't enough. It needs to be challenged. It needs to be dismantled. It needs to be watched, because left alone, it will turn inward and consume itself. So if you're someone who thinks deeply, who prides yourself on being logical, rational, intelligent, this message is for you. Your mind is powerful, but it's not always honest. It doesn't always want what's true. Sometimes it just wants to protect what's familiar. And sometimes the only way to break free is to stop thinking harder and start thinking deeper. The curse of overthinking, how intelligence creates paralysis in disguise. Overthinking is not thinking too much, it's thinking in circles. It's the illusion of progress, the sensation of movement when you've actually gone nowhere. And for the intelligent mind, it feels like mastery. It feels like control. But Nietzsche knew better. He understood that intelligence, unchecked, often turns inward and begins to cannibalize itself. The mind becomes obsessed with predicting every outcome, analyzing every variable, mastering every possibility until action becomes impossible. And here's the tragedy: the smarter you are, the more convincing your reasons become for doing nothing. We don't talk enough about how intelligence can become a form of self-sabotage. We praise deep thinking, but we rarely ask what happens when thinking becomes a shield, a delay, a defense mechanism. Sometimes what we call analysis is just fear wearing a lab coat. We say we're being cautious. We say we're just weighing our options. But behind that is a terror we don't want to name, the terror of being wrong, the terror of making a mistake, of looking foolish, of risking our identity as the smart one. So instead of acting, we calculate, but we theorize, we hesitate, and the world moves on without us. Nietzsche would say this is the curse of modern man. We've become so obsessed with knowing that we've forgotten how to live. We want guarantees. We want predictions. We want certainty before we move. But life doesn't operate that way. Life is chaotic, unpredictable, filled with contradiction. You cannot think your way into clarity. At some point you have to leap, but the overthinker never leaps. They linger on the edge, paralyzed by their own awareness. And the smarter they are, the more intricate their reasons become for staying still. Consider how many times you've told yourself, "I just need to think it through a little more," when in reality, you've already thought it through 100 times. You've looped the same scenario, the same variables, the same fears. You're not gaining insight, you're avoiding risk. And the more you think, the more you question your decisions. Not because they're bad, but because your mind is addicted to control. And any action that involves uncertainty feels unacceptable. So you stall, and stall, and stall, until momentum dies. This is why some of the most brilliant people remain unseen, unheard, unfulfilled, because they're trapped in their own mental perfectionism. They want to be right before they're real. They want to be certain before they're visible. But that certainty never comes. And so, they become silent philosophers, masters of theory, but ghosts in practice. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But too often, the intelligent person becomes obsessed with the how and forgets the why. They get lost in the maze of mechanics and lose touch with the fire of intention. Let's take a step back and ask something raw. What would your life look like if you acted on what you already know? Not what you're still researching. Not what you're waiting to understand fully. But what you already know in your gut, in your bones, in the silence between thoughts. What if the problem isn't that you don't know enough, but that you won't trust what you know? Because at a certain point, knowledge becomes noise. The pursuit of more information stops being empowering and starts being exhausting. But you don't need another book. You don't need another opinion. You need courage. And courage doesn't come from more thinking. It comes from choosing, from stepping forward, even when the outcome is unclear, even when your mind is screaming objections, even when there are 10,000 reasons to wait. Overthinking is seductive because it feels responsible. But it's just procrastination dressed in intellectual robes. It's the mind refusing to let go. And here's the most painful part: the longer you stay in overthinking, the more your confidence erodes. Because every day you hesitate, you reinforce the belief that you can't trust yourself, that you're not ready, that there's always something missing. And over time, that belief becomes your reality. You become someone who never moves, someone who never risks, someone who never arrives. Nietzsche would argue that the only solution is to embrace the irrational, to reawaken the instinct, the will, the inner force that drives action without needing every answer. He believed in the Dionysian spirit, the chaotic, passionate, life-affirming part of us that leaps before it calculates. Not recklessly, but authentically, because real living requires risk. It demands imperfection. It requires that we fail sometimes, that we stumble, that we bleed, and in doing so we become. So I'll ask you this: what has overthinking cost you? Not just in time, but in opportunity, in joy, in identity. How many dreams have you buried under the weight of analysis? How many relationships have you avoided, projects you never started, paths you never explored, not because you couldn't, but because you thought too much. This is the paradox. Intelligence helps you understand the world, but it can also keep you from engaging with it. And until you learn to silence your mind long enough to move, you'll always be watching life instead of living it. The ego of the enlightened, how smart people mistake understanding for growth. There's a unique kind of arrogance that only the intelligent suffer from, the arrogance of insight. It's subtle, often invisible, because it hides behind noble ideas. It sounds like wisdom. It looks like self-awareness. But it's something else entirely. It's the belief that because we understand something, we've already transcended it. That insight alone is transformation. That knowing why we do something is enough to stop doing it. But Nietzsche challenges this illusion. He exposes knowledge without action as a form of spiritual laziness. He reminds us that to see is not to be. That comprehension is not the same as change. And yet, how often do we mistake one for the other? Think of the moments when you've had a breakthrough. You read a passage in a book, or you watched a video, or had a deep conversation, and suddenly everything clicked. You felt awakened. You saw your patterns, your fears, your self-deception. And for a moment, it felt like you had changed. But then, life returned. The days passed. The old habits crept back in. The insight faded. And nothing in your behavior actually shifted. Why? Because we confuse the feeling of enlightenment with the work of transformation. We believe that, because we've named the problem, we've solved it. But naming is just the beginning. The ego, especially the intellectual ego, loves to collect insights like trophies. It doesn't want to be transformed, it wants to be admired for how aware it is. Nietzsche saw this in the intellectual class of his time. He saw thinkers who could dissect morality, analyze truth, critique religion, and question existence, but who still lived small, fearful, and disconnected lives. They had knowledge, but no courage. They had clarity, but no will. And Nietzsche, in his ruthless honesty, called them hollow. He saw their brilliance as a mask. He knew that understanding life is not the same as engaging with it. And he believed that the greatest danger for the intelligent is not ignorance, it's the illusion of wisdom. And that illusion is powerful, because it allows you to avoid discomfort while still feeling superior. You don't have to take risks, you can just explain why risks are unnecessary. You don't have to confront your flaws, you can just intellectualize them. You don't have to evolve, you can just talk about evolution. And in doing so, you build a self-image that is untouchable, but also unchanging. You become someone who is always observing, always interpreting, always commenting, but never experiencing. You become a philosopher of your own life, not a participant in it. Let me ask you something that cuts to the bone. What truths have you accepted intellectually but refused to embody? What principles do you preach but not practice? What insights have you turned into decorations instead of tools? If you're honest, you'll see a gap, a painful, humbling gap between what you know and how you live. And in that gap lives your ego. Not the loud, boastful ego, the quiet one. The one that says, I already know this, every time life tries to teach you something again. The one that believes it's above repetition, above failure, above the beginner's humility. Nietzsche would say that real growth doesn't happen in the mind, it happens in the body, in the behavior, in the blood. It happens when your insights become instincts, when your values show up in your actions, not just in your theories. He would say that if your philosophy doesn't change how you walk, how you speak, how you treat people, then it's not philosophy. It's performance. And here's the twist: the more intelligent you are, the more seductive the performance becomes. Because you can sound wise without being wise. You can say all the right things, quote all the right authors, dissect all the right ideas, and still be ruled by fear, by pride, by laziness. Intelligence becomes your shield, and growth becomes your excuse. You say, "I'm still processing," when what you need is to start practicing. So here's the challenge: can you take what you know and live it? Not once, not perfectly, but consistently. Can you let your insights cost you something? Your comfort, your image, your certainty. Because if your enlightenment only makes you feel smarter but not braver, kinder, truer, it isn't enlightenment. It's ego in disguise. The final trap: why the smart avoid simplicity and how it destroys them. There's a final, devastating trap that awaits the intelligent: the rejection of simplicity. It begins subtly. A quiet disdain for the obvious. A quiet craving for the complex. The smart mind wants to feel challenged, to feel rare, to feel separate from the herd. And so, it begins to look down on the simple truths of life as naive, shallow, or beneath it. Discipline? That's for people who don't understand nuance. Gratitude? That's just a feel-good trick for the masses. Love? That's just a chemical illusion. And in this rejection of simplicity, something sacred is lost. The intelligent person becomes a cynic not because the world is broken, but because they've built a worldview too complicated to allow joy. Nietzsche saw this in the intellectual elite, people so obsessed with tearing down illusions that they tore down meaning itself. People who mistook skepticism for depth and complexity for truth. But he also knew this: truth often hides in the simple. Not because it's easy, but because it's essential. The problem is, intelligence tends to overcomplicate. It wants layers, exceptions, frameworks. But life doesn't care about your complexity. Life runs on simple principles, repeated with discipline and love. Eat well, sleep well. Move your body. Tell the truth. Forgive, focus, create, connect. These aren't shallow ideas. They're foundational, and they're hard. Not because they're intellectually demanding, but because they require practice. But they require humility, repetition, presence. And the intelligent mind, always seeking novelty, often runs from that. Let's be brutally honest. How many times have you dismissed something that could change your life just because it sounded too simple? How many times have you rolled your eyes at basic advice, not because it was wrong, but because it didn't flatter your intellect? We want solutions that feel as complicated as we are. We want systems that match our inner chaos. And so we avoid the path that actually works. We chase complexity like a drug. And every time we do, we move further from what our soul truly needs. Nietzsche believed in the eternal return, not just as a metaphysical idea, but as a spiritual test. If you had to live your life over and over again, in the exact same way, would you choose it? And that idea doesn't require a PhD to understand. It's simple. But it's also terrifying because it forces you to look at your habits, your choices, your patterns, and ask if they're worth repeating forever. That's the kind of simplicity the intelligent mind runs from. Not because it's stupid, but because it's true. And truth, when it's simple, becomes undeniable. You can't hide behind theories. You can't argue your way out. You either live it or you don't. So here's the final, humbling question. What simple truth have you been complicating to avoid responsibility? Is it the truth that you already know what to do, but haven't done it? The truth that you don't need another book, you need to act? The truth that your deepest problems don't require more thinking, they require more courage? Simplicity isn't the enemy of intelligence. It's the test of it. The highest form of intelligence is not complexity. It's clarity. The ability to strip away everything unnecessary and return to what matters. The ability to hold the simplest truths, not with arrogance, but with reverence. That is wisdom. That is power. Nietzsche didn't want you to become more clever. He wanted you to become more honest, more alive, more real. And that requires you to let go of the need to always be the smartest person in the room and instead become the most present, the most grounded, the most willing to act. So in the end, maybe the real test of intelligence isn't how much you know, but how much you're willing to live. Maybe being truly smart means having the strength to do what's simple, to do what's clear, to do what's hard again and again without needing it to feel complicated. Because in a world obsessed with overthinking, overanalyzing, and over-explaining, the wisest move might just be the simplest one. Do the thing. Live the truth. Let go of the need to be brilliant and become someone who moves. That's the paradox of intelligence. And that's why the smart get fooled. Not by others, but by themselves.